So, as Steve said last week, today is the final one in our series from Acts on sharing our story. And in fact, it's also the final sermon in our trio of series looking at prayer, care, and share. And last week, Steve promised that this week would be the ultimate sermon, because last week was the penultimate. So obviously no pressure, but what I want us to do is to think about that couplet as well as this sermon series, and to recognize perhaps that the ultimate, the one thing that underpins everything that we've been thinking about over these months, is to be found and experienced in that place where God's story intersects with ours. Because each one of us, if we've come to faith, know the truth of this. That's what we experience in prayer. That's what motivates us to care. And that is what we have to share. And because of Jesus, because of our relationship with Jesus, each one of us, whether we recognize it or not, has a story that is worth sharing, just like that one that Gareth read to us from Acts just now. Because stories, in and of themselves, have remarkable power. We only have to think about Christmas to realize that. Think of the adverts that we see on TV at Christmas time. Who would have thought that we would be so invested in a carrot called Kevin? Have we lost my pictures of Kevin? Or have you already seen them? Look at that. Don't we just love Kevin? And yet we are, aren't we? We're totally invested in the story of Kevin the Carrot. Because stories are a touching point. They draw us in. They capture our imagination. And I think this is why that Jesus taught so often in stories. But this is also why our stories are so important as part of how we share our faith. Because whenever God transforms a life, your story, that story, becomes one of his greatest illustrations. And our individual testimony of God at work in our lives is precious because it demonstrates what Jesus can and does do, even in the most ordinary of lives. So, the scene that we have before us in our passage is Paul. Paul on trial. He's been brought before King Agrippa, the Roman Emperor Festus, the military commanders, and a whole load of other really significant people in the city of Caesarea. And he's been asked to give an answer for the accusations against him. And remarkably, what we see in this space is, despite the formality of the setting, despite the seriousness of the accusations that have been made against him, despite Paul's own like for a bit of a debate and an argument, in this space, he doesn't elaborate on all the accusations that are brought against him. And instead, he simply chooses to share his story. And so, whilst humanly speaking, this looks and is, in fact, just a courtroom, what we discover is that as Paul tells his story, it becomes a mission opportunity. Because Paul's story is really God's story. And wherever we are, whoever we are, our personal testimony is always something that is powerful and persuasive as a form of witness. Because people are often far more open to the story that we have to tell than they are to engaging in arguments. So what is it that we can learn from Paul and from the way that he shares his story in this moment that might help us and encourage us and enthuse us that we have a story to tell? Well, first of all, and I think the most simple thing perhaps, is that when Paul is asked to give an account, he starts from a place of honesty. And he shares his story just as it is. He doesn't try and shape it or argue it or create something different to what it is. He brings who he is and he shares that. So he openly describes in this moment who he used to be. He was a Pharisee. He was passionate. He was sincere. He was convinced that he was right. And he doesn't paint himself as particularly wicked, does he? He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't immoral. In fact, he was deeply religious. And yet, his life and his story reveals that being deeply religious without Jesus is empty and can actually lead us to being people who oppose God's will. In Paul's case, he was responsible for hunting down, for imprisoning, for approving the execution of believers, and for trying to force Christians to turn against the God that they had come to believe in. And he doesn't try and airbrush or move past any of that past. He doesn't pretend it doesn't happen. He simply states that that's who he was. Now, probably most of us won't have a story that is quite as dramatic as Paul's. We may have grown up in a Christian home. We may have remained quite close to God over the years. We might have grown away from God, wandered. Some of us will have come to faith slowly, quietly over time. Some more suddenly. Some may have encountered God through times of suffering. Some simply through friendships, through investigation, through questioning. For each and every one of us, our journey to faith will be different. But for every one of us, the miracle of faith, of God at work, alive in your life, is the same. We all have a story of before Christ, because we all need to come to that point where we accept him for ourselves. But whether that's gradual or sudden, it's still a miracle, because it's that coming to God, the way that he brings together the people that we are intended to be and weaves together the pieces of our lives to create something even more beautiful. That is the beginning of our story of faith. And the picture I have really of that is that it's a bit like a stained glass window. The individual pieces of glass are significant and pretty and important on their own, but when they come together, when they are woven together, we see the beauty. And I think it's the craftsman's skill in fusing those pieces together that enables us to see the story, to see the picture. And a good craftsman doesn't hide the cracks or discard the pieces that he doesn't want. He uses them. And so too, God draws together the pieces of our lives, and with the glory of his story, creates something that is a story worth sharing. But while our personal story, our testimony matters, if it's all about us as we retell the story, then we've missed the point. Because the center of Paul's story is never Paul himself, it's always Jesus. He points beyond himself to Jesus, because it was his encounter with Jesus on that Damascus road that changed everything for him. And I think it's quite interesting, isn't it, that this is the third time we have heard Paul's conversion story already in Acts. Every time Luke tells us the story, the skeleton of it is the same, but the content, the details are slightly different. Because every time it's retold, it's done for a different purpose to a different audience. And so that same thing is true for us. We have a story to tell, but it will change. The emphasis of which bits we pull out and which bits we share will depend on who we're talking to and when we're talking to them. But Paul, he thought Jesus was dead. He thought Christians were deceived, and yet he encountered God. God's grace met him, interrupted him as he was going, interrupted him not with accusation, but with that invitation to come and follow him, and in a way that was so undeniable that it changed the direction of his life. And it's this change in direction, this encounter with God, that is at the heart of every testimony. And the important part is never really what we've done. It's always who Jesus is and what Jesus has done. So we don't have to worry if our story isn't particularly exciting, because the power of our testimony isn't in how dramatic or exciting we think our conversion story is. It's always to be found in how wonderful and how transcendent and how amazing our personal Saviour is. We don't need to be the hero in our stories, because however we tell them, Jesus already is. And I wonder if sometimes we, particularly if we've been Christians for a while, begin to lose sight of just how amazing it is that God, in the person of Jesus, has met us, is interested in each one of us, and loves us enough to be involved in our lives. Imagine if when you read a dramatic story, the kind that Pete was talking about earlier on, all you were talking about at the end was how brilliantly the drowning person sank. It's not the point, is it? The point of a rescue story is in how amazing the rescuer was, how amazing the rescue itself is. And that's the same with the gospel. It's all about Jesus, the one who rescues us. So we tell our story, and we weave into it the story of God's grace and God's purpose, because our stories only find their purpose and their meaning. They only make sense when we can understand them in the context of God's bigger story. And as we listen to Paul's account here in Acts, we notice how often he points us back towards God. God promised, God raised Jesus, Jesus appeared, Jesus called, Jesus sent, Jesus opened eyes, Jesus forgave. Paul is simply telling, in this point of his testimony, that way, that place where his story interacts with God's work, and how amazing that was. Because he's framing his life, his experience, in God's big picture. He's not saying, look at what I've done. He's saying, look at what God has done. So it's important for us as we think about our story to know God, to know his big picture story, so that we see where we fit within that. To find a way of understanding God's story and God's truth that we can share simply and clearly, so that it makes sense to us and it might make sense to others. But Paul's story doesn't finish there. It isn't just that Jesus saved him, it's that he saved him for something. He tells us not just about his conversion, but about his calling and his commission. And we notice the language that he uses. He talks about Jesus saying, I have appeared to you to anoint you, to appoint you. I am sending you. And this point of conversion for Paul was a point of commission. The turning point, as he encountered Jesus, changed what he was doing. It gave him not only a new understanding of God, but a new purpose for his own life. Because he had a mission. He was going to go on to open people's eyes, to help them turn from darkness to light, from the power of Satan to God. What an amazing transformation. If we think about the person that he was the man who once tried to close people's eyes, was brought to a place where he spread light and opened eyes. Isn't it an amazing thing to think about the way that God chooses the aspects of our stories that perhaps feel like the greatest of our failures to use for his purposes? We think through the Bible narrative, we think back to Moses, who protested that he couldn't speak, and yet God used him as a spokesperson. Peter, who denied Jesus, and yet God used him to become a shepherd. Paul hunted Christians, and yet God turned him around and enabled him to become perhaps the greatest missionary the church has ever known. You see, God delights in using our failures, in using who we are, and rewriting our stories in a way that brings transformation, but also furthers his kingdom. And I wonder what aspects of our stories we think a bit beyond God, and yet he would choose to use. Sometimes we think that our testimony is simply a story about how we became a Christian. But for Paul, that wasn't true, and actually for us, that simply isn't true, because our testimony, our conversion point, is only part of the bigger story. Our stories are continually growing, and they include always how God is changing us, shaping us now. They include the prayers that he's answered, the strength he's given us, the forgiveness we have received and go on receiving, the hope that we've found, the faithfulness that we've continued to experience. People need not just to hear that Jesus saved us, but that he walks with us today, and it makes a difference to the people that we are and to the lives that we live. Not just yesterday, not just today, but tomorrow and the day after that and all of our tomorrows. In our day of prayer, a couple of Tuesdays ago, somebody shared, quite honestly, that we find sharing our faith difficult. And I think that's true, isn't it? We hear the word evangelism and we shrink inside. And yet, we just need to let that go a little bit. Because the reality is that the majority of the time, God isn't asking any more of us simply than to be a people who love him, grow in relationship with him, and get on with doing whatever it is that he has called us to do in our day-to-day lives. Because the people that we rub up against, the people who see us, may not be people who read the Bible, but they will be reading your lives. They will be seeing who you are, how you live, what motivates you, what is different about you. And so the story that they read in the life that you live makes a difference. 1 Peter 3:15 encourages us to always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you, to give the reason for the hope that you have. It doesn't say we have to answer every question. It says that we have to be able to give a reason for the hope that we have. And that's testimony. That's our story. It's simple. It should be personal and it should be authentic. Because whilst not everyone is called to be an evangelist, every one of us is called to be a witness. And a witness is simply somebody who tells what they have seen and what they have experienced. We don't need to have all the answers. And in fact, it's probably good if we don't, because nobody likes a know-it-all. But what we are called to do is to tell the truth, to engage with people where they're at, to listen to what they're interested in, to listen to other people's stories, and to be able to give a window into the lives that we live, the faith that we have, and the God that we have found, and the difference that it makes. Paul, perhaps the greatest evangelist that the church has ever known, could have chosen this moment to defend himself with legal arguments, to astound everyone with his greatest theological prowess. But instead, he took that opportunity and he shared his story. And in doing so, he introduced people to Jesus, to God's story, and to God's purposes. And God has written his story of grace into every one of our lives if we are people who know him and love him. And we each have a story to tell, not because of who we are in isolation, but because of who Jesus is and because of who we are in him. Some of our stories will be dramatic. Some of us will be quiet and unassuming. Some will involve radical, dramatic transformation, and others will describe faithful growth over decades. But every story we have to tell is precious because we are precious. And where your story intersects with God's story, it becomes part of his witness to the world. So don't underestimate the power of your testimony. Be encouraged to tell it, to share it, to tell it honestly, to tell it humbly, to tell it often, and above all, to keep Jesus at the very center of the story that you tell. To tell his story through yours. Because in the end, the greatest testimony is not how extraordinary our lives are, not even how dramatic our failures are, but it is always how extraordinary our God is.